PowerPoint for y'all.
It's okay. I'll bring it down.
So we're in the middle of the legislative session right now, which means I lived in Austin for 5 months, and so life has been a little bit insane. So I do not have a PowerPoint for y'all. But what I would like to do is just invite y'all to make this more of an interactive talk with y'all questions, because the topic we're talking about today very much affects all of you and your future professions as medical students, or as just a doctor or future physicians. So just let me know if you have questions. As Shelby said, my name is Emily Horne. I've worked for Texas Right to Life for 8 years now. It's my 5th legislative session that we're in the middle of right now. I'm a doctor. I am not a lawyer. I have been mistaken for a lawyer because I talk about the laws a lot. I don't practice law, I just write them. And but as a fellow Texan, as someone that might be, facing end-of-life care decisions one day in a Texas hospital, I care very much about this. And so I know this is something that y'all will be dealing with as well in your future years. So, I'm curious, Shelby said there's kind of a mixture of like first, second, third, fourth year students. Like, have most of y'all taken a medical ethics class at this point? Yeah, some? Yeah, okay. What do y'all, y'all might talk about this in other classes, I don't know. What are some of the principles of ethics, bioethics, kind of medical ethics? Yeah.
There's just 2 things. So like, there's some nursing students and PT students in here too. So we got a good mix of like different professions. And that's why, from a med student perspective, one of the things that they hit on pretty hard is like patient autonomy.
Yeah.
Especially with advanced directives and things like that. And so that's one thing.
Yeah, autonomy is a big one, right? And autonomy is a big one for right to life advocacy too. Is like you want to respect the individual body. And so, before birth, that comes in the form of you want to respect the life of the child and the life of the mother, so the body is both. But at the end of life, you kind of want the patient to be the one directing their healthcare to the extent possible. And then there's a principle of like doing no harm, non-maleficence, principle of justice, you want to see justice served. There's another one called beneficence, so just like doing good. And this comes obviously into play in a lot of other medical professions, right? And these are just basic ethical principles. So, when you apply this to end of life, person closest to the patient or the patient themselves should be making the decisions as much as possible. The doctor should try to benefit the patient and do no harm and seek justice for the patient. So that's kind of how that plays out in the end of life. And so, my perspective on all of this, we have a law in Texas that greatly affects patients at the end of their lives, or just regarding advanced directives, that we see as a very anti-life law. And so Texas Right to Life is very involved in trying to change it, but also serving as a patient advocate. But I'm gathering that probably not a lot of you have already heard in detail what this law is, and so I'm going to kind of lay it out and just tell you about it, and then we can kind of talk about the ethics and how that plays out. So, right now, y'all know about advanced directives. Like, if someone is thinking about the end of their life and they want to direct how that's going to go, and they want to write out their wishes, they write an advanced directive. They might also write a medical power of attorney and say, I don't really know what situation I'm going to be in, but I want this person to make a call because they know me well, they know what I want. Or they might say, I know exactly what I want, here's an advanced directive. Or just kind of, in the absence of any of those things, you also have, by default, by statute, you have a list of family members or people close to them that are authorized to make those decisions. So there's always a desire in law to kind of preserve that closest to the patient, like closest level, to follow their wishes, that kind of thing. Right now, though, in Texas, in the advanced directives chapter, it says essentially, if there's disagreement between what the patient wants and what the doctor or hospital wants, then there's a process that they can start. And the end goal of the process is, in the end, the hospital or doctor gets to override the patient wishes. Literally, this section is called Process to Override Advanced Directives, or something like that. It's a process to override the wishes that have been outlined by the patient. So what they do, anybody in here have heard of an ethics committee? So ethics committee, right, like is usually, there's one per hospital. I don't know, sometimes bigger hospital systems, I'm not sure it's different, per system, but like usually there are a series of issues that an ethics committee needs to and can and will consider on a whole range of issues. So like there's a lot of people that will volunteer and just say like, this is something I'm interested in, I'd like to serve on the ethics committee. So it's made up of a lot of different disciplinary kind of professions in the medical field, some not even medicals, like some chaplains are on the ethics committee. And so they consider and they hear a lot of different matters. And so most of the time the ethics committee is already a sitting committee at the hospital. And so the physician, if they disagree, and it's always generally speaking, I have never seen this play out otherwise, it's going to be if the family member wants a treatment that the physician does not want to provide. And we're talking, just side note, about basic treatment, food and water, ventilator, dialysis, life-sustaining care, not chemo, not crazy experimental procedures, not experimental surgeries, but basic life-sustaining care. So when basic life-sustaining care is wanted and the doctor doesn't agree, or the hospital or whoever, they call the meeting of the ethics committee, they give the patient or their family 2 days notice, and that's all they have, is just 2 days notice to try to figure this out. And I mean, y'all all know, like in situations where you have a very, very sick loved one, it's pretty chaotic, you're kind of operating on crisis level, it's very hard to sort through information and hear what's being said and like figure out what the most important thing is. And so they get a notice and like a lot of other papers that says we're having a meeting to discuss termination of care in 2 days, you're welcome to attend. In the middle of all those stack of papers, they also get a list of essentially phone numbers, contact information for a list of organizations that have agreed to help serve as patient advocates. And we are on that list, Texas Right to Life, so that's how we get these calls. We serve as patient advocates. If we get a call in enough time, we go to the meeting with the family. But there's nothing in law that actually specifies who can attend. So we're not prohibited from attending, but theoretically if the hospital wanted to say we're not required by law to let you attend, that's correct. In this law, all of the power is laid in the hands of the hospital and really none on the hands of the patient. So they call a meeting, they have a meeting. The only thing that's required in law for them to be able to remove care is that they have a meeting and they decide either to follow the doctor's recommendation or whatever, but they decide to remove care. There's no justification required. There's no reason they have to give. They don't have to prove futility. They don't have to have a written record of their decision. They just have to simply decide, we have decided to remove care. And the patient has 10 days to find a transfer to another hospital or another physician, or they have complete civil immunity to remove care. So there's a lot of things in that. There's no appeal, there's no record, there's no reason. You don't have to prove anything to the patient. And I mean, I think that violates a lot of justice, right? So like it's a lot, I mean, people in the legal profession look at this law and they say, well, it's death without due process, which is very much a legal way of looking at it, right? But it's also, from a justice standpoint, it doesn't seem right that anyone should be able to decide that you cannot have life-sustaining care for no reason that they have to prove. So, as I said, they have 10 days after the meeting, and I mean, as you get more and more into hospital systems, you will see patients cannot effect a transfer. Transfers are from doctors to doctors or hospitals to hospitals. They have to be effectuated within the hospital system. The social worker has to call the other case manager, and a lot of these internal hospital policies, all these systems have to work together for a transfer to be found, secured, and effectuated. It's really impossible for a patient or their family or even us to call hospitals and say, hey, can you take this patient? Because that's not really how it works. They're like, who are you? Why are you calling? Get their doctor to call. But as you've seen, since the hospital already has complete immunity, and they know that all they have to do is wait out the 10 days, there is a complete lack of incentive for them to do anything to find a transfer for that patient. So the patient's left in a completely helpless position, and even as patient advocates, there's very little we can do because the hospital has no incentive to help. So Texas is actually alone in this. No other state has quite as progressive a law as Texas does. 10 other states have this same kind of structure, the meeting, the ethics committee kind of, it almost works more like a mediation and a complaint resolution process than a heavy-handed, like, well, we've made the call and we don't have any options. Because there is not a countdown. There's not the 10-day, we're just gonna wait out the clock until this happens. In other states, what they do is they say, we disagree, we think this treatment is futile, we will help you transfer to another hospital, and we will treat you until then. So treatment pending transfer is what a lot of other states do. The most populous state that does this is New York. And so we were looking at some of these laws, and I did this massive research project a couple of years ago, and I'm like, how come New York, I mean, they have large population, millions and millions and millions of people. A lot of the complaints we hear about this law is, well, patients will just want care indefinitely, or it's too expensive, or whatever. You know, Texas is caring for too many patients, we don't have the resources, and I thought, well, New York's probably in a lot of the same situation, right? So they have a very large state, and just similar problems population-wise that Texas does. So we actually called the New York legislator to pass this law, and he just said, that was the hardest law I ever passed. I got shot from all sides. The medical profession said that I was going to cause indefinite care, and it was going to be insane and expensive. And he said, after it passed, I never heard a word. I never heard of a problem. I never heard of anything going wrong. And so we were like, I mean, I don't know that that's like indicative of enough of a study. It's not like a data survey, but that's pretty interesting, right? He said it was the only, he's a progressive Democrat. He said it's the only bill I ever passed that had ACLU of New York and Right to Life of New York at the bill signing together. And I was like, well, all right, that works pretty well, because we would go to that bill signing too. And I think the ACLU of Texas actually would come to that bill signing too. So I thought that was funny. So really quickly, I'll just tell you what kind of the defenders of the law would say, the critics of the law would say, and give you all a couple of examples. And then just if y'all have any questions, I'm happy to kind of talk through scenarios with y'all. Defenders of the law say, as I said, that providing care indefinitely is too expensive, that you have to have an option for too many beds being taken up, you know, that patients have poor quality of life, and so they're being unreasonable, they want too much care, and that hospitals just have to ultimately have some kind of like fail-safe mechanism to ultimately make the call when patients are just being too unreasonable or their families. That's what the defenders say. The critics say, again, like I said, death without due process, that this process is really 100% balanced in favor of the hospital. And as you kind of seen, like the patients don't really have any options. They don't have, yeah.
You're saying the law again?
So, I mean, it's contained within the Texas Advanced Directives Act, but that law is kind of like our broad structure for advanced directives and power of attorney.
I think it's important as well to point out it actually does say that they have to provide a reason for their decision, and that the facility and the physician have to help the patient transfer.
It does
So
say
it
that.
says that in the
There's
law.
no enforcement of that. So it says that they have to tell them what the decision is. It doesn't have to say to tell them what the reason is.
They have to explain it, yes they do, and they have to put it in the medical record, that's in the law. And then hospitals put that in their policy.
So there's a lot of things that the law says, but I have found in my experience at these meetings that a lot of these rules are bent because there's not ultimately anyone holding them accountable to do those things. And I feel like I should also state, I know I have seen some worst case scenarios, and I know that that's not always what happens, but looking at it from a legal standpoint of there's not really a lot of safeguards in place, that's kind of where our problems with the law are, because I know that the majority of doctors and the majority of hospitals are not trying to do this to every patient. That's not the norm. I understand that. And so we're trying to kind of work out a situation where there's more balance than not. And so the other part of it is because there's just kind of a fail-safe, like they say there's no immunity, there's a complete immunity for doctors who follow this, and I get that, right? Because malpractice insurance is insane. Malpractice lawsuits were on the rise in the 90s, and there was kind of this situation where doctors were leaving the state in the mid-90s in Texas, and it was just creating a real problem. So I think that it kind of bent it all the other way to where now there's not really any kind of a intervention to where families can say, okay, but in this situation, there was really something wrong done, and we weren't really able to seek any kind of legal remedy. And so there's got to be some kind of balance there. In some cases, I feel like I should also say, in some cases when patients are dealing with a serious injury, they're not necessarily at the end of their life. They may just be very sick. They may be dealing with a serious injury that needs more time to heal. So in one situation, we had the family of a 12-year-old boy call us, and he had suffered a gunshot wound to the head, and he was dealing with a traumatic brain injury. And so it looked very much like he was not going to make it, and they were getting pressured to remove him from treatment. And I mean, there was a mess because the family wasn't on the same page necessarily, and so the mother was fighting for her son's life. And so we got involved, and we were able to ask the hospital to just extend the time a little bit. And he started to recover, and he was a 12-year-old boy, and eventually, with a little more time, they saw some improvements happen. They backed off, and he was actually able to go home and undergo therapy. So that's, you know, a rare situation, right? And so it's not, yeah.
A quick question. So, with the law being proposed that you're recommending, is if the family or whoever's making the decisions for the patient in place of the family decides that the patient should remain on care, have these things done to them by the hospital, by the doctor, that will be the do-all, say-all, the final decision maker?
No, because I think in a lot of situations, if it is, like I said, we're talking about basic care, right? And so we're talking about, in a lot of cases, a low level of care. So in a lot of cases, an ICU isn't really the appropriate place for them, right? And so I think in a lot of cases, transfer to a different care setting or a more long-term care setting, depending on what the prognosis is, could be appropriate. So I don't think transfers are bad, and I don't think that intensive care is always the answer either. And in some cases, if the patient, so I'll just say, in some cases the patient really is dying, in some cases they're not. So the other part, and I'll come back to your question if that's okay. So the other part of this is sometimes they are at the end of their life, and this process puts a whole lot of strain and stress on a family when they're trying to just spend the last moments of their life with a loved one. And so in one case I saw, there was a woman that had gone in, and she was older, and so she went in with a simple injury, and things quickly got a lot worse. And so she was on her deathbed, and her children were fighting for her life, or they were just fighting, I think, because they felt like they were not being heard, and they just wanted her to be cared for. And it escalated, it became very adversarial between her, the family, and the hospital. And so in the end, I attended the ethics committee meeting with the daughter, and the mother passed away during the ethics committee meeting. And so it was one of those situations where, I mean, they were just distraught, they were devastated, they felt like they had been robbed of the last days of their mother's life. And it had gotten so adversarial, the communication really broke down. And so I was just sitting there thinking, like, why is this necessary? Like, why is it that there wasn't just, I don't know, that in this situation it became so adversarial that they weren't able to spend those last couple of days in peace. And so there's obviously a middle ground between all of this, right? Like sometimes the families have a really hard time working with the hospital. And so in regards to what we proposed, our current proposed law that we are working on leaves the ethics committee hearing process in place, because a lot of times, like I said, communication breaks down, it becomes adversarial, the patients kind of become just frustrated and they feel like they're not being heard. And so in a lot of cases, bringing in more people, talking out the case, having almost like a mediation type process between the family and the hospital sometimes does lead the family to kind of look at the case, answer some hard questions, realize that maybe what they are wanting is just not gonna, a miracle is not going to happen. And so, but in some cases, you know, maybe it's different. Maybe they just want to put their loved one in a long-term care facility, in a nursing kind of facility, if they have more days left to live. And so our proposal is that we keep the ethics committee in place, but take away the 10 days, so that there is more of an incentive to transfer, and the hospital can work together with the family if an agreement still can be reached and another care setting can be sought and all of that. And which again does work in 11 other states. And so we think that that's more balanced, gives more consideration to the patient without giving the hospital a complete lack of options. Yes.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the emphasis is on putting more incentive in the transfer process.
Yes.
They're not gonna like force the doctor, I mean, some doctors may be like, I'm not gonna treat this patient, whatever, but like at least make it where there's incentive, like, okay, we need to transfer this patient, let's operate.
Right, there's more, so it doesn't take away all avenues that the doctor has. If there is a breakdown, if the family, if they just cannot really trust each other, but that's a problem too. And so, yeah, just working out something to where there's kind of another option that's considered and pursued. Yeah. Yes.
So pretty much like you're putting the responsibility of the transfer on the hospital. Is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's true. I think the hospital already kind of does have the responsibility of transfer because it's very hard for a patient to do that anyway. It is a hospital kind of process. But in this case, the patient's not ultimately,
Yeah,
kind
they're
of
not
left with.
completely responsible for managing the process.
Right, and the incentives are placed to find that transfer back on the hospital.
So I had like a follow-up question with that, which is if the hospital found a transfer, but the patient or their family refuses that option, like what happens typically in these other states that have this law?
The family doesn't get to,
They don't get to decide.
they don't get to say,
Okay.
no, it's this hospital and nothing else, and that's
Okay.
not what we're proposing either.
I think you need to consider for changing legislation, actually the biggest barrier to those transfers is insurance companies because they won't, and the receiving hospital because they won't receive if it's not an escalation of care, and insurance companies are not that interested in it unless it's a de-escalation.
Okay,
So if you're moving to a care facility, so say you really do just need life-sustaining treatment rather than any kinds of interventions, then you might move to an LTAC or nursing home.
right,
Insurances companies will be happy with that, but if you
Right,
want
right.
to transfer to another hospital, the barrier is normally not the transferring hospital, it's the receiving hospital.
right, and I do agree with you there, that like sometimes another hospital just isn't really appropriate either, especially if we are talking about such a low level of care. And so so that's part of the way that the family has to come a certain way too, right? And just they can't say, it's this or else, like we demand this. I mean, sometimes they don't just have the ability to do that, especially if there are insurance difficulties or their family member doesn't need that kind of intensive care, or just there's nothing that can be gained from that kind of intensive care. I would agree with you there, yeah.
So my thought too was like at a place like here where you have palliative care, sometimes you can transfer when you're de-escalating care to a service like palliative care.
Right,
And
right. And so in a
that's
lot of
what we
cases,
do.
like, I
But
agree.
it can
Sometimes
teach-
it's more of like, find a more appropriate type of care.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like looking at what's actually required, what is still beneficial to the patient, because in a lot of cases, there's not a whole lot of treatment options left. And a lot of the ones that I've seen is like, we're not talking about finding another person that can do some kind of a crazy experimental procedure or surgery, because that's already been exhausted. And so, yeah, in a lot of cases, you are looking at a lower level of care or palliative care. Yeah. I'm sorry, so I said I would come back to your question, and now I forgot what it was.
Essentially, you sort of answered my question was sort of like, are you looking to change giving families complete control over what happens medically, or I was wondering what you were proposing to.
Right.
Does that mean
And
you
so,
should go
no,
either?
there's not, I don't know, yeah. The cases I've seen, and we are talking about basic life-sustaining care. So you can't force someone to spend thousands of dollars on an experimental procedure. That doesn't make sense, because in a lot of cases, like you're talking about, in most other medical situations, when the doctor is saying, this is just not a treatment that would do anything for you, that's not the same thing as, we don't want to provide you a ventilator anymore. So that's different. In our mind, that's a different level of like basic life-sustaining care, but not necessarily treatment of your disease, especially if treatment options have been tried and aren't working anymore. So the law that we're talking about doesn't deal with any of that. Yeah. These are really good questions, by the way. Y'all are making me work. Actually, y'all sound a lot like legislators are like, whoa, because they have like, because they hear from every stakeholder, right? And they say, well, this is your side, but like, what is the other part of this? And it's very important to think through kind of all of that as well. Because we do, and like I said, I have a narrow view of this because from my view, I have seen from the patient's side, but you have to have a reasonable, like the law can't only accommodate one person. And making the law for one person is also a very bad idea.
Sorry, and I would just speak to that, because I'm an ethics consultant here at the hospital, and so I get called in for these cases, right?
Okay.
And so very rarely have I ever seen a doctor dispute life-sustaining treatment. And they might dispute interventions, but they
Okay.
don't dispute ventilators, nutrition. If a family or an advanced directive states that people want nutrition and ventilation, then that will continue.
Right.
The conflict arises when they feel, and from the doctor's point of view, I think it's important to not just characterise it as an economic question, because often they feel like they're torturing patients. I've been called on cases where the family is continuing to ask for aggressive treatment right up to the point where the person is lying entirely incapacitated and they're going gangrenous because of their circulation, so their nose will go black, their digits will start being gangrenous, and that it's really past the point at which you're affecting anything positive for that person, and there's a conflict there. So that's quite different
Right.
than just talking
Well,
about
and Right, and I wouldn't want to characterize this as totally economics either, because I mean, I've seen a lot of other, you know, reasonings and characteristics play in this decision as well. And I will also say, we only get called in when it's a
yeah, I
life
mean, we're
decision.
all sides of the same.
Right, and so like, obviously, I know that there's a lot more things that ethics committees have to consider, and I mean, and there's a lot of cases where I'll be talking to the patients because they'll call us, or the families because they'll call us, and I'll say, well, I mean, I'm not a doctor, I can't tell you this intervention will work well. That's just something you're gonna have to work out with them. That's not really what I can do for you, and so I don't know the answer to that. And so just kind of encouraging them, like, you have to, and that's, you know, encouraging them to keep up the communication as much as possible. And ultimately, like, I think it's a good thing whenever there can be kind of like just an effort to increase that communication, because in some cases, like I said, families just don't wanna, they're looking at some very hard questions. And so y'all, having that explained to them, I think does sometimes change their perspective. But in the worst case, when it's not, you know, this is kind of our proposal for how to deal with it. But I do understand that part of it as well. And I should also say, so I said nutrition and hydration. Up until 4 years ago, that was the case. And 4 years ago, there was an amendment to the law that said that artificial nutrition and hydration could no longer be part of this process. So that actually is not something that we're called in on anymore. That's not something that is part of the consideration anymore. So I meant to clarify that, but that is a more recent change to the law. All right. I know I have class at 1, but I don't think we have time.
Another thought, and this was kind of just what I felt like was a good example of ethics at this hospital. For example, TDCJ pronounced brain dead, and the legal next of kin, she got it, but was basically holding out for last, like anything short of a miracle. And despite the fact that the patient had been pronounced brain dead, and the wife didn't want him disconnected from the ventilator, and he, you know, I was in the loop as far as organ donation, where I thought the physicians did a great job and ethics did a great job, was that in the end, they, you know, she, despite the fact that she declined donation at the time, I thought it was just from the heart for those physicians to put themselves in her shoes. They allowed her to, and they allowed him to stay connected to the ventilator until he died, as opposed like cardiac arrested, even though he was already pronounced dead.
Well, in that case, that's what that's above and beyond what the law requires.
Absolutely, and I thought that was, and I mean, I never would have imagined them doing so in the past, you know, thinking of like, oh, this is taking up an ICU bed, so on and so forth, all the resources, but I was just really amazed at the fact that they stepped outside of that normal realm of finances in this today's day and age and really went into taking care of her. And I just thought that was great. I just want to
Yeah.
know that.
Yeah, that's a really good story. All right. I don't want to keep y'all long enough classes, and I'm happy to stick around, but if y'all don't have any other questions, then we'll off. All right.
Any other questions?
She'll be
Nope.
take back over.
Cool.
Thank you
All right,
guys.
thanks for coming, guys.